Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift into the quiet heart of a vast empire. The kind of empire that feels less like a country and more like a weather system. It rolls across continents. It changes the direction of rivers of trade. It bends the lives of farmers, merchants, monks, and kings, even when they have never seen the riders who carry its name. And yet, like all things made by human hands and human minds, it can crack, not with one dramatic explosion, but with a single decision that changes the rules everyone thought were sacred. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere far away in the dark, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how wide this little campfire of a channel reaches. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, or let the rain outside do the work for you. Get comfortable. Seriously, adjust those pillows. Pull up that blanket. Because tonight we're going to follow a story that turns on a choice made in a moment of uncertainty. A choice that looked practical, even necessary, and yet opened a set of cracks that never truly healed. This is history for sleep, and tonight we're asking a deceptively simple question. What happens when an empire grows so wide that the only thing holding it together is a ritual, a shared agreement about legitimacy, and a belief that some rules are bigger than any one man? And what happens when one man, standing at the edge of the empire, decides to bend that rule just a little because waiting feels too risky? Picture this: a cold night on the steppe. The sky is a deep bowl of black glass, scattered with stars. The wind is gentle at first, just enough to make the felt walls of a jur whisper. Somewhere, a horse shifts its weight, the leather tack creaking softly. Smoke from a dung fire curls upward and disappears into the darkness. You can smell it, earthy and dry, mixed with the sharpness of cold air. There is no city glow, no electric hum, no distant highway. Only the steady presence of the land and the sense that if you stand long enough, you can hear the world breathing. For centuries, the steppe shaped people into motion. You didn't build your life around walls and roads. You built it around seasons and water, around the strength of animals and the patience of your own body. The steppe taught a kind of realism. You could be fierce, even ruthless, but you also had to be practical. A winter storm didn't care about your pride. A drought didn't care about your lineage. Survival demanded flexibility. And out of that world came a man who would turn that flexibility into conquest. Temujin, who would become Genghis Khan, was not born into a stable throne. His early life was marked by loss, betrayal, and hunger. But he had a gift that is rare in any age. He understood people. He understood fear. He understood ambition, and he understood how to make loyalty feel bigger than blood. By the early 1200s, he had stitched together fractured tribes into something new. Not just a coalition, but a machine. He reorganized society in units of tens, hundreds, thousands, cutting across old clan lines. He promoted based on merit and loyalty, not just birth. He used law, the yasa, to create a common framework. And he built a culture of movement and communication that could respond fast, like a body that feels pain and reacts before it even thinks. The Mongol expansion was, in many ways, a triumph of logistics. People often imagine conquest as pure violence, a storm of arrows and fire. But conquest on the scale the Mongols achieved required a different kind of power. It required supply lines. It required intelligence. It required discipline. It required the ability to coordinate armies separated by deserts and mountain ranges, to send orders and receive reports with a speed that stunned sedentary states. They built the yam, a relay system of stations where fresh horses waited, where messengers could eat and rest and then ride again. It was a network of movement, a kind of step internet. It allowed a decision made in one place to shape events thousands of miles away, not instantly, but fast enough to matter. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, the Mongol Empire was already enormous. But it was also, in a quiet way, fragile. Because it was more than land. It was relationships. It was negotiated authority. It was the personal prestige of one man and the shared agreement of a ruling family that they would hold together, even when they were separated by distance and temptation. The secret of the empire was that it was, at first, one family enterprise. The sons and grandsons of Genghis were not just nobles. They were the pillars that held up a tent stretched across continents. Each branch of the family expected status, territory, influence. And as long as there was a central figure, a great Khan recognized by all, the tent held. But human beings are not built for perfect unity, especially not when the prize is the world. Tonight, we're going to walk toward a turning point that unfolded in the middle of the 13th century, when the empire was at its peak, when its armies were pushing into China and the Middle East at the same time, when its roads carried silk and silver, and when even the greatest cities in the world had learned to fear the sound of hooves. And then, in the space between death and succession, one political decision was made. It seemed like a solution. It seemed like a way to keep momentum, to prevent chaos. But it broke something invisible. It broke the ritual of consensus. It broke the shared center. And once that center broke, the empire did not fall all at once. It cracked into pieces, into rival khanates, into worlds with their own interests, their own religions, their own priorities. The Mongol Empire would still be powerful for generations, but it would never again be one thing. So settle in. Let your breathing slow. Let the story wash over you like wind across grass. We begin, as so many turning points do, with a death that arrives at the wrong time. Genghis Khan's death was, in a strange way, both expected and dangerous. He had built an empire around his charisma and his authority, but he was also a realist. He knew he would not live forever. The steppe had taught him that life is a thin membrane. A fall from a horse, a fever, a blade in the dark, and the whole world can tilt. He had already made plans. Like many rulers, he faced the problem that every dynasty faces: how to make power survive the person who holds it. In the Mongol world, legitimacy was tied to the lineage of Genghis. To be a great Khan, you needed to be part of that golden line. But you also needed acceptance. Not just a claim, but a ritual confirmation. That ritual was the kurultai, an assembly of nobles and princes where decisions could be made, alliances confirmed, and a new great Khan elevated. In the steppe imagination, this was not merely politics. It was almost spiritual. It was the moment when the family and the nation agreed on a single voice. But here's the problem. Assemblies require people to gather, and gathering is easy when your realm is a cluster of camps. It becomes something else when your realm stretches from the forests of Eastern Europe to the rice fields of China. After Genghis died, his third son, Ojde, became Great Khan. Ojde is sometimes portrayed as less dramatic than his father, less of a legendary storm. But in many ways, he was the builder. He took the conquest machine and turned it into an imperial system. He oversaw the building of Karakorum as a capital, not a city in the Chinese sense, but a hub. He encouraged administration. He expanded the Yam relay network. He managed the delicate balance between different branches of the family. And under his reign, Mongol armies continued to surge outward, reaching into Russia and Eastern Europe, sweeping through Central Asia, pressing deeper into China. Yet even Ojde's reign had the seeds of future tension, because every victory created more land to govern and more wealth to distribute. The princes of the Golden Line wanted their share. The generals wanted rewards. The administrators, many of them from conquered peoples, wanted stability and rules. Every success made the empire richer and more complex. Ojde died in 1241. And that moment matters because it revealed something important. Even a system built by the most disciplined conquerors in the world could be slowed by the politics of succession. When Ojde died, the empire did not immediately choose a new great Khan. There was a regency led by his widow Torjin, and for years the princes maneuvered. They held back. They tried to shape the future in their favor. In a smaller empire, this might have been a manageable pause. But the Mongol Empire was not small. Armies were in motion. Governors were collecting taxes. Trade routes were being secured. And the longer the center wavered, the more each region learned to act on its own. Eventually, in 1246, Ojday's son Gayuk became Great Khan. But by then, suspicion and rivalry had deepened. Gayuk's reign was short. He died in 1248, and again the question of succession opened like a wound. At this point, it's useful to understand that the Mongol ruling family was not one simple line. Genghis had multiple sons, and each son had his own descendants, each with their own ambitions. The major branches were linked to the sons Jachai, Chagatai, Ojday, and Toluid. Jachai's descendants would dominate the western steppe, the region that would become known as the Golden Horde. Chagatai's descendants held Central Asia. Ojday's descendants had their own claims and territories. Toluid's descendants, the youngest branch, would rise to extraordinary prominence, producing figures like Mongke, Kublai, and Hulagu. These branches were not just family. They were political blocs. Each had allies among generals, among administrators, among subject peoples. Each had economic interests. Each had a sense of what the empire should be. When Gayuk died, the empire faced a choice. Would it continue under Ojday's line, or would power shift to another branch? Through maneuvering, alliances, and a kind of steppe realpolitik, power shifted to Toluid's line. In 1251, Möngke, a son of Toluid, became Great Khan. Möngke was a serious man, a ruler who understood that conquest had created an empire that needed management. He wanted to tighten control. He conducted censuses. He tried to curb corruption. He demanded loyalty. Under Möngke, the empire launched some of its most ambitious campaigns. In the Middle East, Mongol armies pushed toward Persia and beyond. In China, they pressed against the southern Song, a wealthy and resilient dynasty that still held the richest parts of the country. The empire was now doing what few empires ever do successfully. It was fighting major wars in different directions at the same time. It was trying to coordinate armies that operated in radically different environments. The steppe riders who could cross grasslands like water had to adapt to mountains, to deserts, to humid river valleys, to fortified cities with thick walls. And it was doing all of this while maintaining the delicate ritual of unity among princes who were separated by the very distances their empire had conquered. This is where you can begin to feel the tension, like a rope stretched too tight. The Mongol Empire was powerful, it was feared, it was rich, but it was also reaching a point where geography itself became an enemy. In the steppe world, distance is a fact of life, but it is also a kind of freedom. You can move, you can relocate, you can shift your camp. But an empire based on cities, on taxes, on trade has roots. It has weight. It cannot simply move without consequences. By the late 1250s, Möngke Khan was leading a campaign against the southern Song. His brothers were key commanders and governors. Kublai, one of his brothers, had been entrusted with authority in northern China. learning Chinese administration, building relationships with local elites, absorbing the logic of a sedentary empire. Hulagu, another brother, had been sent west, leading the campaign that would destroy the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and establish Mongol dominance in Persia. It was a moment of astonishing Mongol power. The empire's center was still nominally the steppe. The great Khan's authority still, in theory, extended everywhere. But in practice, these brothers were becoming rulers in their own right, shaped by the lands they governed. And then Möngke died. He died in 1259 during the campaign in China. And the moment he died, the empire entered the dangerous twilight space between one ruler and the next. In that space, everything depends on speed, on communication, on trust. The news had to travel. Riders had to carry it across mountains and deserts, through relay stations, past rivers and hostile zones. And while the news traveled, men who were already powerful would begin to think, quietly at first, about what should happen next. This is the part of the story that feels almost like a slow inhale, the calm before a storm, because you can imagine it. Somewhere in the empire, in a palace with carved wooden beams, a messenger arrives, dust on his boots, eyes red with exhaustion. Somewhere else, in a tent camp near a river, a prince hears the news by firelight. Somewhere in Persia, amid the ruins of a great city, the word reaches Hulagu, and each time the same thought appears like a shadow. Who will be great Khan? And then comes the decision that cracked the Mongol Empire. To understand why the decision mattered, we need to slow down and look closely at what succession meant in the Mongol world. Because it wasn't simply a matter of inheritance, like a crown passing from father to eldest son. The Mongol tradition emphasized a kind of collective authority among the ruling family. The great Khan was elevated by agreement. He was the one voice chosen from among the princes, confirmed by a gathering that symbolized unity. The kurultai was essential. It was how you turned raw power into legitimate power. It was how you told the world and your rivals and your own allies that this was not merely a seizure. This was order. But the kurultai had a problem that grew larger with every conquest. To hold it properly, the major princes needed to be present. And the major princes were not sitting in one place. They were scattered across an empire that could take months to cross. Imagine the distance. From the grasslands of Mongolia to the forests of Russia. From the Mongol heartland to the cities of Persia. From the steppe to the shores of the South China Sea. Even with the yam relay system, even with fresh horses waiting, messages took time, and people took even more time. This meant that the moment the great Khan died, the empire was vulnerable. There was a pause, there was uncertainty, and in that uncertainty, local leaders had to make decisions. Armies had to keep moving or stop. Taxes had to be collected or delayed. Alliances had to be maintained. And because the Mongol Empire was built on momentum, on continuous movement, the idea of stopping, of waiting months for princes to gather, was not just inconvenient. It felt dangerous. It felt like giving your enemies time to breathe. It felt like inviting rebellion. So what did the Mongols do? In earlier successions, they waited as best they could. They held back major campaigns. They brought princes together. They performed the ritual. It was slow, but it preserved unity. But by 1259, the empire was too big and too busy to pause easily. Hulagu was in the west, deep in the Middle East. Kublai was in China, engaged in administration and conquest. Ariq Böke, another brother, was closer to the heartland, in Mongolia, holding the traditional center. Ariq Böke is often portrayed as the more traditional candidate. He had stayed closer to the steppe, closer to Karakorum, closer to the old ways. Kublai, by contrast, was increasingly shaped by China. He had adopted aspects of Chinese governance. He had a court that included Chinese advisors. He understood how to rule cities, how to collect taxes, how to stabilize a sedentary population. This difference mattered because it hinted at two visions of the empire. One vision was that the Mongol Empire should remain at its core, a steppe empire. The center should stay in Mongolia. The great Khan should be first among nomadic princes. The conquered lands were sources of tribute and resources, but the heart, the identity, should remain on the grasslands. The other vision, the one Kublai represented, was more subtle. It suggested that the empire's future might lie in the richest and most populated lands it had conquered. That the great Khan might rule not just as a steppe leader, but as a universal emperor, using the institutions of China, building a more stable bureaucratic state. These visions were not necessarily incompatible at first. Empires can hold contradictions, but contradictions become dangerous when they are tied to succession. When news of Möngke's death reached Kublai, he faced a choice. The traditional path would have been to return toward Mongolia, to gather with the other princes, to hold a kurultai in the heartland, and to allow the collective decision to unfold. That would take time. It would mean leaving his position in China. It would mean risking the stability he had built. It would mean trusting that his rivals would not move against him while he was in transit. And Kublai was not a naive man. He understood that power is not only a title, it is networks, it is resources, it is the ability to act quickly. So he made a decision. He held his own kurultai. In 1260, Kublai convened an assembly in his territory near his base in northern China. He gathered supporters. He secured endorsements. He accepted election as Great Khan. He did this without waiting for the full consensus of the empire. Almost simultaneously, Ariq Böke held his own kurultai in Karakorum in the traditional heartland and was also declared Great Khan. Two kurultais, two great Khans, two centers. This is the decision that cracked the empire, not because it immediately destroyed Mongol power, but because it broke the ritual of unity. The kurultai had been a way to say, "We are one family, one empire." Now it became a tool of faction, a weapon. Once you have two great Khans, you no longer have a single source of legitimacy. Every prince, every general, every governor must choose. And choice creates lines. Lines become borders. Borders become wars. The conflict that followed is known as the Toluid Civil War, named after Toluid, father of both Kublai and Ariq Böke. It was not, at first, a clash of massive armies like the earlier Mongol conquests. It was a struggle of logistics, of alliances, of control over supply routes and key cities. Ariq Böke's strength was the traditional center. He had Karakorum. He had the support of many steppe nobles who feared the empire becoming too Chinese. He had access to the old heartland resources. Kublai's strength was wealth and administration. He had northern China with its farms, its cities, its tax base. He had experience in governing a large population. He had resources that could supply armies in ways the steppe could not. The war played out in a way that reveals something profound about the empire. The Mongols had conquered sedentary states using mobility and discipline. But now, their own internal conflict was shaped by the sedentary world. It became about controlling grain. It became about controlling trade routes. It became about controlling the infrastructure that makes an empire more than raiding. Imagine the calm of a steppe road in winter, snow flattening the grass, a caravan moving slowly, oxen breathing steam. Now imagine that road becoming a strategic lifeline. Whoever controls it controls the flow of food, of horses, of weapons, of information. In the Civil War, these lifelines became targets. Kublai used his control of agricultural regions to squeeze Ariq Böke. He cut off supplies. He leveraged cities that could store grain. He used the bureaucratic machinery of China to support his cause. Ariq Böke tried to rally the heartland, to maintain the idea that legitimacy belonged in Mongolia. But he faced an enemy that was not simply another steppe prince. He faced a rival who had access to the richest region the Mongols had conquered. The war lasted for years. It was not the kind of war that creates immediate dramatic collapse. It was a war that eroded trust. It forced princes and generals to reveal their loyalties. It encouraged regional leaders to act independently, to prioritize their own survival. And as the empire fought itself, other cracks widened. In the West, the Golden Horde, led by Böke, a grandson of Genghis through Jachai, clashed with Hulagu's forces in Persia. This was partly personal, partly political, partly religious. Böke had converted to Islam, and the destruction of Baghdad by Hulagu and the fall of the Caliphate carried a weight that went beyond politics. It became a symbol, a wound. So even while the brothers fought for the title of Great Khan, the great wings of the empire were beginning to behave like separate worlds. And this is why Kublai's decision mattered so much. If he had waited, if he had insisted on a single kurultai in the heartland, perhaps the empire would still have fractured eventually. Distance and ambition were powerful forces, but the ritual might have slowed the break. It might have preserved the idea that unity was sacred. By holding his own kurultai, Kublai created a precedent. He showed that the center could be moved. He showed that legitimacy could be manufactured locally. He showed that the empire did not need one gathering place. Once that idea existed, it could not be undone. Now, as you listen, let the story become softer, like the sound of hooves fading into the night. Because the empire did not end here. It transformed. It fractured into 4 major khanates, each with its own identity, and each shaped by the lands it ruled. And in those khanates, you can see the long shadow of that one decision, like a crack in ice that spreads outward, silent and slow, until the surface is no longer one piece. Let's take a slow, gentle walk across the empire as it begins to separate, not in a clean break, but in a gradual drift. Imagine you're looking down from high above, not like a modern satellite, but like a dreaming spirit, watching the movement of people and caravans and armies across the earth. The Mongol Empire is still there. The roads still run. The messengers still ride. The fear and awe still linger in the minds of cities. But now there are subtle changes, like a river that has begun to divide into channels. In the east, Kublai's power base is China. And China is not just a land, it's a system. It's bureaucracy. It's rice paddies and granaries, tax registers and magistrates. It's walled cities and canals. It's a world where legitimacy is tied not only to blood, but to the mandate of heaven, to the idea that a ruler must bring order and prosperity. Kublai understood this. He didn't just want to be a Mongol prince ruling over China. He wanted to be an emperor in the Chinese sense, and this required a shift in identity. It required adopting Chinese titles. It required supporting Confucian-style administration, even while maintaining Mongol privilege. It required building a capital that looked like an imperial center, with palaces and ceremonial spaces. When Kublai ultimately founded the Yuan dynasty, he was not simply ruling a khanate. He was creating a new kind of state. The Mongol Empire, in his vision, would become something like a Chinese empire with a Mongol ruling class. But this was exactly what many steppe nobles feared. Because to them, China was not only rich, it was also dangerous. It was a land that had absorbed conquerors before. The steppe memory held stories of nomadic rulers who entered China and became Chinese, losing their steppe identity, their mobility, their toughness. Becoming soft, as the old stereotypes would say, but more accurately, becoming tied to cities and paper and officials. So Kublai's move toward China pulled the eastern wing of the empire into a different orbit. In the West, Hulagu established what we call the Ilkhanate, centered in Persia. Persia had its own deep civilization, with cities that were ancient even by medieval standards, with administrators trained in sophisticated tax systems, with poets and scholars, with a web of trade that connected to the Islamic world. Hulagu's conquest of Baghdad in 1258 was one of the most dramatic events of the era. Baghdad, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, was not just a city. It was a symbol of Islamic authority and cultural brilliance. Its fall shocked the world. The Mongols, who had already terrified Europe and Asia, now seemed like an unstoppable force. But ruling Persia required different skills than riding across the steppe. Hulagu and his successors relied heavily on Persian administrators. They had to manage a Muslim population, a land with irrigation systems and complex agriculture. They had to negotiate with local elites. Over time, the Ilkhanate became increasingly integrated with the Islamic and Persian world. Eventually, its rulers converted to Islam. So the Western wing, too, was being shaped by its environment. In the north and west, the Golden Horde dominated the steppe and the forest zones of Russia and Eastern Europe. This region was different again. It was a world of long rivers, of forests and open plains, of Slavic principalities and trading routes that connected to the Black Sea. The Golden Horde extracted tribute. It influenced the politics of Russian princes. It controlled trade corridors. And its rulers, like Böke, developed their own religious identities, often becoming Muslim as they interacted with Islamic merchants and scholars. The Golden Horde was less interested in being governed by a great Khan in China. Their world was far away. Their priorities were local. They had their own rivalries, their own economic interests. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate held the region that had been part of Chagatai's inheritance. Central Asia was a crossroads. It had oasis cities like Samarkand and Bukhara. It had trade routes that carried silk and spices, horses and slaves. It had a mixture of nomadic and settled life, a blend of steppe and city. The Chagatai rulers navigated these worlds, sometimes leaning into steppe traditions, sometimes relying on urban administration. So you can see the pattern. Each Khanate became shaped by the land it ruled, by the people it taxed, by the religions it encountered, by the trade networks it relied on. This kind of regionalization might have happened even if succession rituals remained perfect. Geography pushes empires toward decentralization. But what made the Mongol case particularly sharp was the way legitimacy fractured. When Kublai and Ariq Böke held rival kurultais, it wasn't just a family feud. It was a signal that the empire no longer had one unquestioned center. And once that center was questionable, regional rulers had more room to say, why should we obey? Why should we send tribute? Why should we accept decisions made far away? The Great Khan title remained important in theory. Kublai eventually won the Civil War. Ariq Böke surrendered in 1264. Kublai was, on paper, the Great Khan, but in practice, his authority over the other khanates was limited. They might acknowledge him nominally, but they acted independently. It's like a wheel that has lost its hub. The spokes still exist, but they are no longer held together with the same strength. Now let's slow down further and focus on the human side, because empires are not abstractions. They are made of people who eat and sleep and worry. The decision that cracked the empire was made by a man with fears and ambitions, surrounded by advisors, thinking about threats that felt immediate. Imagine Kublai in his camp or palace, receiving news of Möngke's death. The message is not just sorrow, it's opportunity and danger. If he leaves China and travels to Mongolia, he risks losing control. The Southern Song might take advantage. Local officials might shift loyalty. Rivals might move against him. If he stays, he risks being seen as illegitimate, as someone who refuses tradition. So he chooses the path that secures his base. He chooses speed. He chooses a local kurultai. This is the kind of decision that makes sense in the moment. It's the kind of decision leaders make when they feel trapped between ideal rules and practical survival. And that is why it is so haunting. Because it reminds us that history often turns not on evil or virtue, but on practical choices made under pressure. Choices that solve one problem and create another. In the following years, the Mongol world became a landscape of shifting alliances. The Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate fought. The Chagatai Khanate had its own internal struggles. Kublai focused on conquering the Southern Song, which he eventually did in 1279, completing the Mongol conquest of China. But by then, the empire was already divided in spirit. And once divided in spirit, division in policy followed. Trade routes became contested. Communication slowed. The Yam network, so vital to imperial unity, became less reliable across Khanate borders. Each region developed its own priorities. Even the Mongols themselves began to change. The Mongols in China became part of a complex, multi-ethnic empire. The Mongols in Persia became part of the Islamic world. The Mongols in the Golden Horde became intertwined with Turkic peoples and Slavic politics. The Mongols in Central Asia navigated a mix of steppe and city. The empire had, in a sense, conquered the world. And then the world began to conquer the empire back, not militarily at first, but culturally, administratively, spiritually. Now let's take a gentle pause. Breathe in, breathe out. Imagine that step night again. The stars above, the fire low, the horses quiet. Think of how strange it is that something so vast can be held together by something so delicate as agreement. The Mongol Empire at its peak was like a tent stretched across the earth. Strong, flexible, resilient. But a tent depends on tension. It depends on ropes pulled tight, on poles held upright, on a center point that gives shape. The decision to hold rival kurultais loosened that tension. It shifted the poles. It made the center ambiguous. And once the center is ambiguous, the wind can get in. In the next part of our story, we'll explore the practical forces that made unity so hard to maintain. The impossible logistics of ruling a continent-spanning empire. The sheer weight of distance. The way different environments force different kinds of governance. And how the Mongols, masters of mobility, found that mobility alone could not solve the problem of ruling the world. When we talk about the Mongol Empire, it's tempting to imagine an endless tide of riders, arrows darkening the sky, cities falling like dominoes. But to understand why the empire cracked, you have to understand that conquest is only the first half of empire. The second half is administration. And administration is, in many ways, slower, quieter, and more demanding. The Mongols were brilliant at movement. Their armies could travel astonishing distances. They could live off their herds. They could coordinate in battle with signals and discipline. But an empire does not just move. It must also stay. It must maintain supply lines. It must collect taxes. It must keep peace among different peoples. It must build institutions that last longer than a single campaign. In the early years, the Mongols managed this by using what already existed. They relied on local administrators. They adopted existing tax systems. They used the skills of conquered peoples, Chinese officials, Persian bureaucrats, Turkic merchants, to keep the empire functioning. This was pragmatic and effective. It allowed the Mongols to rule without reinventing everything. But it also meant that each region of the empire developed its own administrative culture based on local traditions. China had a long tradition of centralized bureaucracy. Persia had its own sophisticated administrative class. The steppe had a more personal, clan-based system. Russia and Eastern Europe had tributary structures and local princely politics. So even within a unified empire, there were different ways of doing things, different expectations, different concepts of legitimacy. Now add to this the problem of distance. Imagine a message traveling from Karakorum to Persia. Even with the YAM relay system, it would take weeks. A message from China to the Golden Horde might take months. And that's in good conditions. with no storms, no wars, no broken stations. This means that a governor in Persia might have to make decisions without waiting for approval. A commander on the western frontier might have to negotiate with local powers on his own. A prince in the Golden Horde might have to respond to threats without guidance from the Great Khan. Over time, this necessity of independent decision-making becomes habit. Habit becomes expectation. Expectation becomes identity. You begin to see yourself not as a servant of a distant center, but as the center of your own world. The Mongols tried to maintain unity through family ties and shared interest. The princes were related. They shared loot. They shared prestige. But family ties are not always bonds. Sometimes they are chains. Sometimes they are competitions. And shared interest can shift as regions become economically distinct. China was wealthy in agriculture and population. Persia was wealthy in trade and urban life. The Golden Horde controlled trade routes and tribute systems. Central Asia was a crossroads. Each region's prosperity depended on different things. When an empire is unified, wealth can flow. Trade can be protected. The Yam network can keep routes open. But when the empire fractures, those flows become contested. Each khanate may tax caravans. Each may impose its own rules. Rivalry can disrupt commerce. There's a subtle irony here. The Mongols helped create a period of increased Eurasian connectivity, sometimes called the Pax Mongolica, a time when trade and travel across the continent became safer and more regular. Merchants could move along routes protected by Mongol authority. Travelers like Marco Polo could journey far. Ideas, technologies, and even diseases moved along these paths. But the very networks that connected the empire also made its fracture visible. Because once authority was divided, the network became a set of borders, and borders create friction. Now think about the sheer variety of the empire. The Mongol rulers were, at their origin, steppe nomads. Their worldview was shaped by sky and grass, by herds and movement. But their subjects included farmers who lived by the rhythm of rice cultivation, craftsmen in cities, scholars in monasteries, merchants in bazaars, and kings in stone castles. To rule such a world, you need flexibility. And the Mongols had flexibility. They were relatively tolerant of religion. They employed people of different backgrounds. They allowed local customs in many cases. But flexibility has a cost. It can make it harder to create a single identity. In some empires, unity is enforced through a common religion or language. The Mongol Empire did not have that. It had a ruling family, a tradition of conquest, and a network of administration. It was more like an umbrella that covered many different worlds. This is why the ritual of the kurultai mattered so much. It was one of the few moments when the empire could feel like one. It was the symbolic gathering that said, "We are united, we choose one voice. So when Kublai held a kurultai in his own territory and Ariq Böke held one in the heartland, the symbolism was devastating. It suggested that the empire was not one umbrella. It was a set of umbrellas, each held by different hands. And then there is the human element of ambition. Kublai did not simply want to preserve the empire. He wanted to shape it. He wanted to be the great Khan. Ariq Böke did not simply want tradition. He wanted power. Hulagu wanted autonomy in Persia. Böke wanted control in the West. The Chagatai rulers wanted their own independence. These ambitions did not exist in a vacuum. They were fueled by the resources each ruler controlled. The Golden Horde had tribute from Russian princes. The Ilkhanate had Persian cities. Kublai had Chinese taxes. Each Khanate could support armies without relying on the Great Khan. In earlier times, a prince might need the Great Khan's approval to launch a major campaign or to receive resources. But by the late 13th century, the Khanates had enough wealth to act independently. This is the classic problem of empire. Once regions become strong enough to sustain themselves, they have less incentive to obey a distant center. The center becomes less a provider and more a constraint. Now let's bring it back to the turning point. Kublai's decision was not only a break with tradition, it was also a recognition of this reality. He knew that if he left his base, his power might fade. He knew that in a world of decentralized resources, control of a region mattered as much as titles. So he created a new center where he stood. He made the ritual follow him. And once you allow the ritual to follow the ruler, rather than the ruler following the ritual, you change the nature of legitimacy. You make it portable. You make it negotiable. You make it, in a sense, political rather than sacred. This is why historians often see the rival kurultais of 1260 as a key turning point. It is the moment when the empire's unity becomes optional. It is the moment when the idea of one great Khan becomes less a universal fact and more a claim to be contested. And that contest had consequences that reached far beyond Mongol politics. It shaped the future of China, Persia, Russia, and Central Asia. It influenced trade networks. It affected the spread of religions. It altered the balance of power across Eurasia. Now, if you're listening in bed with your eyes heavy, you might feel the story turning slower and softer, like a caravan moving under moonlight. Because the next part is less about battles and more about drift, about how each Khanate developed its own path, and how the memory of unity became something like a legend. We'll start with Kublai's world, because it is the most dramatic transformation. The Mongol conquest becoming a Chinese dynasty, the steppe ruler becoming a sedentary emperor, and the way this shift changed the very meaning of what it meant to be Mongol. Kublai's China was a world of contrasts. Imagine the north, with its dry plains and old battlefields, where Mongol riders could still move with familiar ease. And then imagine the south, lush and wet, dense with rivers and canals, where rice paddies reflect the sky and humid air makes metal feel heavy. China is not one landscape, it's many. And to conquer it fully, the Mongols had to adapt. The southern song, which held the rich south, was not a fragile opponent. It had wealth, naval power, fortified cities, and a sophisticated bureaucracy. The Mongols, masters of land warfare, had to learn new tactics. They built fleets. They employed Chinese engineers. They used siege technology on a scale that would have seemed almost magical to steppe warriors a generation earlier. Kublai was obsessed with finishing this conquest, because in his mind, conquering China would not just be another victory. It would be the foundation of his legitimacy. If he could present himself as the ruler of all China, he could claim a kind of universal authority. He could become, in Chinese terms, the son of heaven. This is why the civil war with Ariq Böke was not just about tradition. It was also about the direction of the empire. If Ariq Böke won, the center might remain in Mongolia. The empire might continue to prioritize steppe identity. But if Kublai won, the center would drift toward China. Kublai won, and in winning, he changed the Mongol world. He established a capital that would become known as Khanbalik, later Beijing. He built palaces and ceremonial spaces. He adopted Chinese administrative practices. He used Chinese advisors. He maintained a hierarchy that privileged Mongols, but he also had to rely on the machinery of Chinese governance. This created tension. Mongol nobles who had grown up on the steppe sometimes felt alienated in the Chinese court. The rituals were different. The food was different. The pace of life was different. The very idea of sitting in a palace surrounded by paperwork and officials could feel like a trap. But for Kublai, it was also power. Paper and officials are not glamorous, but they are how you control millions of people. They are how you extract taxes. They are how you enforce law. They are how you maintain an empire without constant warfare. In a sense, Kublai was doing what many conquerors have done. He was becoming the thing he conquered, or at least adopting its tools. And this made the Yuan dynasty strong in some ways and vulnerable in others. One vulnerability was that it created a cultural distance between the Mongol ruling class and the steppe heartland. As Kublai invested in China, the heartland became less central. Karakorum was no longer the unquestioned core. Mongolia became, in some ways, a frontier region of a Chinese-centered empire. For the Mongols who remained in the steppe, this could feel like abandonment. The empire that had begun in their world was now being ruled from a city of walls and officials. Another vulnerability was that ruling China required compromise. The Mongols could not simply impose their will by force forever. They needed stability. They needed cooperation from local elites. They needed to manage agriculture, flood control, and trade. And that meant that the Mongols in China became increasingly tied to Chinese society. They adopted some aspects of Chinese culture. They interacted with Chinese merchants and scholars. They had to navigate the complexities of a multi-ethnic empire. Now think about how this looks from the perspective of the other khanates. If you're a ruler in Persia, your world is Islamic and Persian. You have poets, scholars, and cities that speak a different language. You care about trade routes to the Middle East. You care about relations with neighboring Muslim powers. You are not eager to take orders from a great Khan who is building a Chinese dynasty. If you're a ruler in the Golden Horde, your world is the Western Steppe and Russia. You care about tribute, about controlling river routes, about alliances with local princes. You may have your own religious identity. You may see China as distant and irrelevant. So even though Kublai held the title of Great Khan, his authority became more symbolic than real. The empire was unified on paper, but in practice, it was a federation of semi-independent khanates. And the decision that created this federation was that moment in 1260, when the ritual of legitimacy split. Now let's bring in the Ilkhanate, because it shows another dimension of the fracture. The way regional conflicts, once contained within an empire, become international wars when the empire splits. Hulagu's Ilkhanate was born out of conquest. It was forged in the destruction of cities and the establishment of Mongol rule in Persia and beyond. But it had a problem. To the north, the Golden Horde controlled the steppe and the routes that connected to the Black Sea. To the west, the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt became a powerful enemy, stopping Mongol expansion after the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, a battle that has a kind of symbolic weight as one of the first major defeats of Mongol forces. Hulagu wanted to push further. He wanted to dominate the Islamic world, but he also had to secure his position. And then Böke of the Golden Horde opposed him. Böke and Hulagu were both Mongol princes, both descendants of Genghis, but their interests collided. The Golden Horde controlled routes and resources that the Ilkhanate wanted, and Böke's conversion to Islam added a layer of moral and religious opposition to Hulagu's campaigns. So the Mongol world, once unified, now had Mongol rulers fighting Mongol rulers, not as internal disputes under a great Khan, but as separate states. This is what fragmentation does. It turns family arguments into border wars. And it's worth remembering that these conflicts were not only about pride. They were about control of trade. The Silk Road routes were economic lifelines. Whoever controlled key regions could tax caravans, enrich their treasury, and support armies. So the fracture of the empire had immediate economic consequences. Trade became less predictable. Routes could be interrupted by war. Merchants had to navigate competing authorities. In the long run, this contributed to a gradual weakening of the Pax Mongolica. The network remained, but it was no longer under one umbrella. And as it weakened, the world became more fragmented again, more regional, more contested. Now, if you're still awake, let your mind rest on a simple image. A messenger riding at night. He leaves a relay station, a fresh horse beneath him, the moonlight casting shadows on the path. He rides because information is power. The empire depends on his speed. In a unified empire, his message travels along a chain of stations, protected, expected. In a fractured empire, his message may cross borders, may require permissions, may be delayed by politics. This is how empires feel at the ground level, not like maps, but like the smoothness or roughness of a road, like whether a messenger is welcomed or questioned, like whether a caravan arrives safely or is stopped. The Mongol Empire was once famous for making the roads smoother, safer. The decision of 1260 helped make those roads political. And now, as we drift further, we can see another subtle consequence. When an empire splits, it also splits memory. Each region begins to tell its own version of the story. Kublai's China remembers the Yuan dynasty as an imperial era. Persia remembers the Ilkhans as part of its own history. Russia remembers the Golden Horde as a period of tribute and influence. Central Asia remembers the Chagatai rulers as part of a Turkic-Mongol heritage. The idea of a single Mongol empire becomes something like a myth, a great chapter that belongs to everyone and no one. And yet, in the middle of this myth, we can still point to that one decision, that moment when Kublai chose to bend tradition for practical survival. It's almost like a quiet lesson. Sometimes the thing that holds a system together is not its armies or its wealth, but its shared belief in procedure. Break the procedure and you break the belief. And when belief breaks, the strongest walls can crack. In the next part of our story, we'll return to Ariq Böke because his defeat is not just a footnote. It represents the end of the old center and the moment when Mongolia, the birthplace of the empire, became something less than the heart of it. And then we'll widen out to look at the long-term consequences. How the Khanates evolved. How the empire's fragmentation shaped later history. And why, even today, this turning point feels like a quiet echo across Eurasia. Ariq Böke is, in many popular retellings, the forgotten brother, the shadow who lost to the more famous Kublai. But if you listen carefully to the story, Ariq Böke represents something important. He represents the idea that the Mongol Empire could have remained centered in the steppe, that the old heartland could have continued to be the place where legitimacy lived. When Ariq Böke held his kurultai in Karakorum, he was not simply claiming power. He was claiming tradition. He was saying the center is here, where Genghis once ruled, where the family's sacred line began. He was saying, we will not allow the empire to become a Chinese empire. This is why his supporters mattered. Many steppe nobles feared Kublai's drift toward sedentary governance. They feared that Mongol identity would be diluted. They feared that the privileges of the steppe aristocracy would be threatened by the rise of Chinese-style officials. So the Civil War was not just personal. It was ideological in a quiet way. It was about what the empire should be. Yet Ariq Böke faced harsh realities. The heartland was not as economically strong as China. The steppe could support armies through herds, through mobility, through the traditional nomadic economy. But it could not easily match the grain and tax wealth of northern China. It could not produce the same steady surplus. Ariq Böke tried to compensate by controlling key supply routes, by drawing on support from other branches of the family. He sought alliances. He tried to secure resources from Central Asia. But Kublai's position was simply stronger. When Ariq Böke surrendered in 1264, it was a symbolic moment. The old center had lost. Kublai's victory meant that the great Khan would no longer be primarily a steppe ruler. He would be an emperor of China. And what happened to Karakorum? It did not vanish overnight, but it became less central. It became a relic of an earlier era. Mongolia itself, the birthplace of the empire, became a kind of periphery. This is one of the strange ironies of history. The place that creates an empire is not always the place that benefits most from it. Sometimes the center moves. Sometimes the origin becomes a memory. For the Mongols, this shift was profound. It meant that the culture of the ruling elite changed. It meant that the political rituals of the steppe were no longer the primary language of empire. And once that happened, the other khanates had even less reason to see the Great Khan as their natural leader. If the Great Khan was now an emperor in China, then perhaps the Golden Horde could be a kingdom in the West, the Ilkhanate a dynasty in Persia, the Chagatai a realm in Central Asia. In other words, the victory over Ariq Böke did not reunify the empire. It confirmed the fracture. Now, let's step back and consider the larger consequences. When the Mongol Empire was unified, it created a certain kind of stability across Eurasia. It allowed trade to flow. It allowed ideas to travel. It connected distant regions in ways that were unprecedented. It also, of course, spread violence and destruction. Empires are never purely beneficial, but connectivity is a form of power, and the Mongols created it. When the empire fragmented, that connectivity changed. It did not disappear, but it became more complicated. Trade routes now had to cross different political boundaries. Diplomatic relations became more important. Wars between khanates disrupted movement. This fragmentation also shaped the future of the regions involved. In China, the Yuan dynasty would rule for nearly a century. It would preside over both cultural exchange and social tension. It would maintain Mongol privilege while relying on Chinese administration. It would face rebellion and eventually fall, replaced by the Ming dynasty in 1368. In Persia, the Ilkhanate would convert to Islam and become part of the Islamic world. It would patronize Persian culture. It would eventually decline and fragment as well, but it would leave a legacy of Mongol influence in Persian history. In the West, the Golden Horde would shape Russian politics for generations. The system of tribute and influence would affect the development of Moscow and other principalities. Over time, the Golden Horde would itself fragment, but its imprint would remain in the political landscape of Eastern Europe. In Central Asia, the Chagatai realm would evolve into a mixed Turkic-Mongol world. And from this world would eventually come figures like Timur, who would build his own empire and claim Mongol legacy. So the Mongol Empire did not simply vanish. It left echoes. It left institutions and trade routes. It left genetic and cultural traces. It left stories. And at the center of the story is that moment when unity became optional. Now, let's think about the decision again, but in a gentle, almost philosophical way. Why do humans create rituals like the kurultai? Why do we insist on procedures, on assemblies, on ceremonies? It's because we know that power is dangerous. We know that without rules, the strongest simply take what they can. Rituals are a way to bind power to something bigger than brute force. For the Mongols, the kurultai was a way to say, we are not just warlords. We are a nation. We are a family with a shared destiny. We choose together. Kublai's decision to hold a separate kurultai was not just a political move. It was a statement that he did not trust the collective process, or perhaps that he believed the collective process could not function in an empire of this scale. In a sense, he may have been right. The empire was too big. The distances were too vast. The stakes were too high. But the cost of being right was the loss of unity. This is a theme that appears again and again in history. Institutions and rituals hold systems together. But when systems grow too large or too complex, the rituals become harder to maintain. Leaders begin to bypass them for efficiency. And in bypassing them, they weaken the system's legitimacy. It's like a bridge that is strong as long as everyone crosses at the same place. When someone builds a new crossing elsewhere, the old bridge loses its centrality. People begin to choose different paths. The shared route becomes fragmented. And soon, there is no single road that everyone uses. Now you may be feeling sleepy. That's good. Let the story sink into you slowly. Imagine that step sky again, and imagine the empire as a constellation, points of light connected by invisible lines. In its unified form, the lines are clear, drawn tight. After 1260, the lines begin to shift. Some connections fade, new ones appear. The constellation becomes a cluster of smaller shapes. And yet, even as it fractures, it remains beautiful, in the way that all human complexity is beautiful when you look at it with enough distance. The Mongols were not simply destroyers. They were also builders of networks. They were not simply brutal warriors. They were also pragmatic administrators. They were human beings living in a harsh world, making choices that shaped millions of lives. In the end, the decision that cracked the Mongol Empire was not made by a villain. It was made by a ruler trying to secure his position in a world where waiting felt like weakness. And that is why it is such a perfect bedtime story. Not because it is small, but because it is quietly universal. We all face moments where we choose between procedure and speed, between consensus and control, between tradition and adaptation. We all make decisions that solve immediate problems and create long-term consequences we cannot foresee. Now, in the final section, we'll gently trace the long afterlife of this fracture, how the Khanates drifted further apart, how religion and culture deepened the divides, and how, in the centuries that followed, the Mongol legacy transformed into new empires and new identities. And then, when we're done, we'll return to the quiet steppe night, and we'll let the story fade into the dark like hoofbeats disappearing across grass. Before we go any further, let's linger for a while on the moment of Möngke's death, because turning points often feel, in real life, less like thunder and more like a sudden hush. Historians can draw lines on a timeline, but the people living through it feel something different. A pause, an uncertainty, a strange quiet where everyone waits to see what kind of world will appear next. Möngke had come to power with the determination of a man who believed the empire could still be one thing. He was not only a conqueror, he was a manager. He wanted order. He wanted the princes to send proper tribute. He wanted administrators to stop skimming from the treasury. He wanted the empire to be more than a collection of personal fiefdoms. And yet, even with that seriousness, Möngke was still a Mongol ruler in the classic sense. He believed that legitimacy was born under the open sky, confirmed by the agreement of the ruling family. He believed the great Khan had to be both a warrior and a symbol. In the late 1250s, the Southern Song remained the great obstacle in China. The Mongols had conquered the north, but the south held the richest lands, the densest populations, and the kind of river and canal geography that could turn cavalry into a frustrated visitor. The Song were masters of fortification and supply. They could retreat behind walls, behind waterways, and behind their own administrative depth. So Möngke committed to a major campaign. This was not just another raid. It was a plan to squeeze the Song from multiple directions, to take key strongholds, to break the economic backbone of the South. And as often happens in big plans, the plan itself became part of the stress that would eventually crack the empire. Picture the terrain for a moment. If you're a steppe rider used to seeing the horizon as a simple line, the landscape of southern China can feel like a labyrinth. Hills fold into valleys, rivers loop and branch, forests thicken the air, the ground is wet, the seasons are humid, disease can creep through an army as silently as fog. The Mongols adapted, but adaptation takes time. And time is the one thing a campaign never gives you enough of. Some accounts suggest Möngke died from illness. Others suggest he may have been injured during a siege and then weakened. There is debate in the sources because the 13th century did not leave us neat medical records. What matters, though, is that he died far from the traditional center, in the middle of a hard campaign, in a landscape that did not easily forgive outsiders. Imagine the news spreading outward like ripples in a pond. At first it is confined to the camp, a few generals, a few close advisors, a few trusted guards. There is grief, but there is also calculation because everyone knows what this means. The empire has no great Khan. The princes will move. The question is how quickly. In a modern world, we are used to instant communication. We are used to news appearing everywhere at once. But in the Mongol world, even with the fastest relay system on Earth at the time, news moved at the speed of horses. So the camp becomes a quiet factory of messages. Messengers are chosen. They are given the words to carry. They are handed tablets or seals that prove authenticity. They are sent out along different routes because redundancy is safety. A storm can block one road. An ambush can stop one rider. But if you send many, the news will arrive. Now imagine those riders in the night. They ride hard to the next station, where a fresh horse is waiting. They drink quickly, eat quickly, and ride again. In the steppe, the rhythm of horse travel is familiar, like breathing. But across mountains and through river valleys, it becomes harder. They pass through regions of different languages. They pass through towns where Chinese farmers look up from their work as the rider flashes by. They pass through garrisons where soldiers recognize the urgency in a messenger's posture. They pass through markets where merchants pause for a moment, sensing that something has shifted. And still the rider goes. When the news reaches Kublai, it does not arrive as a calm announcement. It arrives like a stone thrown into a pond that is already filled with tension. Kublai is already powerful. He already has his own court. He already has advisors with their own ambitions. He already has rivals watching him. So the moment he hears the words, he is not only a brother in mourning. He is a political actor in a dangerous arena. The same is true for Ariq Böke, though in a different way. Ariq Böke is closer to the steppe center. He can imagine himself as the natural custodian of tradition, the one who stayed near the hearth while his brothers went to distant frontiers. When he hears the news, he can imagine gathering the princes, calling the kurultai, taking the title, restoring the center to where it belongs. And in Persia, Hulagu hears the news with the perspective of a man who has just built a new world out of conquest. He has armies. He has cities under his control. He has enemies like the Mamluks to contend with. He has to decide whether to return east for the succession or to maintain his position in the west. This is where the empire's size becomes a trap. Each leader is too far from the others to move easily. Each has immediate threats. Each fears what will happen if he leaves his base. So the death of Mong does not simply open a succession process. It opens a set of simultaneous crises, each playing out in different regions, each pushing leaders to prioritize their local realities. And in that push, the shared ritual of unity becomes harder to maintain. It's almost like trying to hold a single conversation across a vast desert with no phones. You can send letters, but by the time the letter arrives, the situation has changed. You can promise cooperation, but the other person must still act alone for weeks. This is why the Mongol Empire, despite its brilliance, was always on the edge of fragmentation. It was built by people who mastered distance, but it still could not abolish distance. Now, take a slow breath. Imagine the empire as a great circle, and imagine that circle expanding outward. The larger it becomes, the thinner its edge, the harder it is to keep one shape. Mongke's death was the moment when the circle stopped expanding smoothly and began to wobble, and into that wobble stepped Kublai, making his choice. Let's talk more about the yam, because it is one of the quiet miracles of the Mongol world. And it also illustrates the limits of even the best communication system when politics become complicated. The yam was a network of relay stations placed at intervals along major routes. At each station, fresh horses waited, food waited, shelter waited. Sometimes guards waited, ready to protect the road. The system was supported by the empire's resources, by taxes and obligations imposed on local communities. It was, in a way, a public service built for an empire of riders. A messenger could ride from station to station at high speed, changing horses and continuing. This meant that news could travel faster than in most other medieval states. It meant that the great Khan could send orders across thousands of miles and have them arrive in weeks rather than months. But there are two things to remember. First, even weeks are a long time in a crisis. Second, a network is only as strong as its political unity. If a station is controlled by a local authority who is loyal to a rival, the network becomes a choke point. During the unified era, the yam was like a set of open doors. A messenger carried a pesa, a kind of passport tablet, granting him the right to demand fresh horses and support. The system depended on recognition. It depended on shared authority. Now imagine what happens when there are two great khans, or when regional rulers begin to act independently. The meaning of the pesa becomes ambiguous. The station master might hesitate. Who is this messenger loyal to? Which seal is legitimate? Should we provide horses or should we delay? Should we report this traveler to our own ruler? This hesitation is where cracks become practical. You can think of it like a river system. When the river flows smoothly, the whole landscape is irrigated. When dams and borders appear, the flow becomes uneven. Some regions dry out, others flood. The network no longer serves the whole. The Mongol Empire relied on speed. Not only military speed, but administrative speed. Decisions about taxes, about punishment, about appointments, about diplomacy needed to move quickly enough to matter. When communication slows, local officials gain autonomy. They make decisions without waiting. They develop their own interests. So fragmentation of communication is not just a symptom of political fracture. It is a cause. Once you cannot reliably transmit orders, the center's authority becomes theoretical. Now, imagine a specific scene. A messenger rides from China towards Central Asia. He carries a message from Kublai's court. Perhaps it is an order or a request for recognition. He reaches a station in a region where local authorities are uncertain, perhaps leaning toward Ariq Böke, perhaps simply cautious. The station master looks at the seal. He listens to the messenger's claim. He feels the weight of decision. If he provides horses quickly, he helps Kublai's message spread. If he delays, he buys time for his own ruler to decide. If he arrests the messenger, he sends a clear signal of loyalty to the other side. These choices, repeated across dozens of stations, become the real battlefield of a civil war. Not only arrows and swords, but permissions, delays, confiscations. Kublai understood this. He used his control of Chinese administration to secure routes. He used his resources to maintain supply lines. He invested in the network where he could. Ariq Böke tried to hold the Heartland network, the routes that ran through Mongolia and Central Asia. But as Kublai's wealth allowed him to build and buy loyalty, Ariq Böke's network became more vulnerable. Now widen the view again. The yam was not only for messengers. It supported merchants, officials, travelers. It was part of the connective tissue that made the empire feel like one world. When the empire fractured, travel became more dangerous. Merchants had to negotiate different rules. They had to carry different permissions. They had to pay more taxes at more borders. And when wars erupted between khanates, entire routes could become unsafe. Over time, this changes the pattern of trade. Some routes decline, others rise. Ports become more important. Sea trade becomes more attractive. The balance of Eurasian commerce shifts. This is why the Mongol fragmentation had consequences beyond politics. It altered the geography of connection. Now, there is another subtle aspect of the Yam system that matters for our story: the way it shaped the psychology of rulers. When you have fast communication, you begin to expect control. You begin to think you can reach everywhere. You begin to believe that distance is a problem you have solved. The Mongols, more than most, had reason to believe this. Their riders could cross vast distances. Their messengers could carry orders quickly. Their armies could appear unexpectedly. But even they could not make the empire small. They could not turn months into minutes. They could not gather princes instantly for a kurultai. So when Möngke died, the empire faced the fundamental truth: rituals require presence, and presence requires time. Kublai's decision can be seen, in part, as an attempt to overcome that truth. If the princes cannot gather in one place quickly enough, then perhaps the ritual can be performed locally. Perhaps legitimacy can be created where power already is. It is a tempting solution. It is also, as we have seen, a dangerous one. Because once you accept local legitimacy, you undermine the reason for a single empire. Now take another breath. Let your shoulders relax. You can almost hear the soft rhythm of hooves, the distant clink of a bridle. The network of stations stretches across the dark like a string of lanterns. In one world, those lanterns guide the same imperial flow. In another world, they become border posts. The difference is not physical. It is political. It is the difference between one shared authority and many competing ones. And that difference began to harden the moment Kublai chose to hold his own kurultai, and Ariq Böke did the same. In the next section, we'll revisit the Toluid Civil War with more detail, not to overwhelm you with dates, but to show how the conflict played out as a struggle over resources and roots. We'll watch the empire fight itself, and we'll see how that fighting made the later fragmentation almost inevitable. The Toluid Civil War can be imagined as a contest between two kinds of power. On one side, the power of tradition and the heartland, represented by Ariq Böke. On the other side, the power of wealth and administration, represented by Kublai. Ariq Böke began with a kind of symbolic advantage. Karakorum was still, in the minds of many, the imperial hearth. It was where envoys had once come to submit. It was where the great Khan had been crowned. To be declared great Khan there carried weight. But symbolism does not feed horses. Kublai's advantage was the ability to mobilize resources at scale. Northern China could produce grain in quantities that steppe economies could not. Cities could manufacture equipment. Tax systems could generate steady income. Even human labor could be organized in ways that nomadic societies rarely attempted. So the war became, in many ways, a competition over supply. Imagine a Mongol army on the move. The classic image is of riders carrying dried meat, drinking mare's milk, living off the land. This worked on the steppe, where pasture was abundant and herds could move with the army. But in a prolonged civil war, especially when fighting near settled regions, supply becomes more complicated. Kublai could use granaries. He could use river transport. He could use Chinese logistical systems. He could feed larger forces for longer periods. Ariq Böke relied more on traditional steppe resources and on the loyalty of steppe nobles. He tried to secure grain from agricultural regions where possible, but his position was less stable. The war included battles, but it also included blockades and sieges, political maneuvers, and attempts to cut each other off from key resources. One of the crucial strategic realities was control of Central Asia. Central Asia was a crossroads. It connected the heartland to the west. It held oasis cities that could supply armies and provide revenue. Whoever controlled Central Asia could influence both logistics and diplomacy. Ariq Böke sought support among figures in Central Asia, including members of the Chagatai realm and others who could provide resources. Kublai, meanwhile, tried to secure loyalty through promises and rewards. This is how civil wars often work. They are not only fought with weapons, but with gifts, threats, marriages, and negotiations. Now, remember that this was not a civil war in a modern nation-state. It was a conflict within a ruling family that governed a multi-ethnic empire. This meant that local officials, Chinese administrators, Central Asian elites, all had to decide which side to support. In China, many officials favored Kublai because he represented stability and continuity of administration. He had already built a governing apparatus. He had relationships with Chinese elites. Supporting him could mean predictable rule. In the steppe heartland, many nobles favored Ariq Böke because he represented the old order. Supporting him could mean preserving traditional privileges. So the war drew out the fault line between steppe and city. Kublai also had the advantage of being able to present himself as a legitimate great Khan even while holding his own kurultai. He could claim that he was acting in the empire's best interest, that he was preventing chaos, that he was continuing Möngke's vision. Ariq Böke could claim that Kublai was illegitimate, that he had violated tradition, that he was becoming too Chinese. He could frame himself as the defender of the Mongol essence. These claims mattered because legitimacy was not only about force, it was about persuading others to join you. As the war dragged on, Kublai's control of resources began to make the difference. He could sustain campaigns. He could buy loyalty. He could blockade Ariq Böke's access to supplies. Eventually, Ariq Böke's position weakened. His supporters dwindled. His ability to feed and pay armies declined. And in 1264 he surrendered. When Ariq Böke surrendered, Kublai had won the title. But what had he lost? He had lost, perhaps without fully realizing it, the idea of unanimous consent. He had shown that the great Khan could be made by faction. He had forced others to choose sides. He had created resentments that would not vanish simply because the war ended. Some nobles in the steppe never fully accepted his rule. Some regional rulers acknowledged him in name but acted independently. The Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate continued their own rivalry. The Chagatai realm maintained its own autonomy. So the war ended, but the fracture remained. Now, there is a quiet tragedy in this. Because the Mongol Empire, for all its violence, had created a kind of shared world. It had connected regions that had previously been separated by fear and distance. It had created a single political horizon. The Civil War turned that horizon into multiple horizons. And once people begin to live within separate horizons, they develop separate priorities. They stop thinking of the empire as a single project. This is why the decision of 1260 is so powerful. It is the moment when unity became negotiable, when the empire became a set of choices rather than a single fate. Now let's shift west again for a while, because while Kublai and Ariq Böke fought, another conflict was unfolding that showed the same pattern. Mongols fighting Mongols, not as a temporary family argument, but as rival states with different religious and economic identities. This is the conflict between Böke of the Golden Horde and Hulagu of the Ilkhanate. And it matters because it shows that fragmentation was not limited to the question of the Great Khan. It was spreading across the empire like a crack in ice, branching out in unexpected directions. Böke and Hulagu were cousins, both grandsons of Genghis Khan. Their rivalry is one of those historical stories that feels, at first, like a personal feud. But the deeper you listen, the more you hear the sound of whole regions pulling away from each other. Hulagu's campaign in the Middle East was one of the most dramatic expansions of Mongol power. His armies moved through Persia and toward Iraq. In 1258, they captured Baghdad, and the Abbasid Caliphate, which had symbolized Islamic authority for centuries, fell. The city was devastated. The shock waves traveled across the Muslim world and beyond. For some Mongols, this was simply conquest, the continuation of an imperial project. For many Muslims, it was a catastrophe, a wound that felt spiritual as well as political. Böke had converted to Islam. This conversion was not merely a private belief. In the medieval world, religion and politics were intertwined. To become Muslim was to enter a community, to gain legitimacy among Muslim subjects and allies, to align yourself with a broader ideological framework. So Böke's perspective on Hulagu's actions was different. Hulagu's destruction of Baghdad could be seen not only as a political act, but as an assault on the heart of Islam. Now add to this the practical rivalry. The Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate had competing interests in the Caucasus and the trade routes that ran through it. Control of these regions meant control of wealth. So you have a perfect storm: religious tension, economic rivalry, and the general weakening of central authority due to the succession crisis. When the Mongol Empire was unified, a great Khan might have mediated such disputes, or at least imposed some limits. But in the fractured world, Böke and Hulagu could act as independent rulers. The conflict between their forces erupted into warfare in the early 1260s. Battles were fought near rivers and in the rugged terrain of the Caucasus. Armies moved across landscapes that were far from the steppe heartland, landscapes where weather and geography could be as deadly as enemy arrows. This war mattered for another reason. It diverted Mongol resources. It prevented the empire from presenting a united front against external enemies. One of those enemies was the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt. The Mamluks were a military elite, many of them originally enslaved soldiers who had built a powerful state. They were disciplined, skilled, and motivated. When Mongol forces pushed into Syria, the Mamluks resisted. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, the Mamluks defeated a Mongol army. This was not the first time Mongols had been defeated, but it was symbolically significant. It showed that the Mongols were not invincible. It showed that determined resistance could succeed. And it's important to note that Mongol fragmentation contributed to this outcome. Hulagu had withdrawn much of his army eastward due to the succession crisis and the need to secure his position. The forces left in Syria were weaker. The empire's internal problems reduced its external power. This is another pattern of history. Civil wars weaken empires. They create opportunities for enemies. So the decision that cracked the Mongol Empire did not only create internal division, it also altered the balance of power in the wider world. Over time, the Ilkhanate would continue to struggle with the Mamluks and with internal issues. The Golden Horde would continue to shape the politics of Russia. The rivalry between these Mongol states became a defining feature of the post-unified era. Now, let's imagine the human experience again. A soldier in the Golden Horde might see the Ilkhanate not as a fellow Mongol realm, but as a rival. A merchant traveling between these regions might have to navigate new dangers and new taxes. A local prince in the Caucasus might find himself caught between competing Mongol powers, negotiating survival. This is how fragmentation feels. It multiplies the number of authorities. It multiplies the number of risks. It makes life less predictable. And yet, even within this fragmentation, the Mongol legacy remained. The Khanates shared a common ancestry, a common history of conquest. They shared certain military traditions. They shared a sense of steppe heritage, even as their cultures diverged. This created a strange tension. They were related and they were rivals. They were part of a shared story and they were writing different chapters. Now, as we approach the end of our long journey, let's take one more slow look at the decision itself, not as a single act of ambition, but as a moment when the empire revealed its limits. Kublai chose to hold a local kurultai because he could not afford to wait. He could not risk losing his base. He could not trust that the old process would protect him. In doing so, he made a rational choice, but he also made a choice that undermined the empire's shared ritual. Ariq Böke responded by holding his own kurultai, because from his perspective, tradition was being stolen. He could not allow legitimacy to be created far from the heartland. He could not allow the empire to drift into China. In doing so, he also made a rational choice, but he also reinforced the split. So the crack was not made by one man alone. It was made by the collision of rational choices under the pressure of a vast, overextended system. This is why the story feels so modern, even though it is medieval. Systems grow. They become too complex for old rituals. Leaders bypass procedure for speed. Rival leaders defend procedure for legitimacy. The system fractures. And then, life goes on in the new fragmented world with new borders and new identities. Now, let's return to the beginning one last time. Imagine the steppe at night, the wind moving gently across grass, stars steady above. In that quiet world, the idea of gathering under the open sky to choose a leader makes perfect sense. It is simple. It is communal. It is grounded. But when your empire stretches from the Yellow River to the Danube, the open sky is no longer one sky. It is many skies. And gathering becomes difficult. The Mongol Empire was, in a sense, a triumph over geography. It connected distant lands. It moved faster than anyone thought possible. It built networks of communication and trade. But in the end, it could not overcome the human realities of ambition and the geographic reality of distance. One decision made in 1260 did not create every problem, but it revealed the empire's vulnerability. It broke the symbol of unity. It turned succession from a shared ritual into a contest. And once succession becomes a contest, an empire becomes a set of states. So as you drift toward sleep, let this be the last gentle thought. Great forces in history often turn on small, practical choices. A decision about where to gather. A decision about whether to wait. A decision about whether tradition can bend. And in the quiet after those decisions, the world reshapes itself. Good night. There's one more layer to this story that feels worth lingering on, because it explains why the crack, once opened, was so hard to close. It's the layer of pure physical reality. The Mongol Empire was not just wide on a map. It was wide in the way that matters to bodies, wide in the way that matters to tired horses, to cold hands, to hungry stomachs, to officials waiting for letters that never arrive. When we say impossible logistics, it's easy to imagine that as an abstract problem like a line on a chart. But logistics is intimate. Logistics is whether there is grass for the horses. Logistics is whether the river is frozen enough to cross. Logistics is whether a caravan can find water before the next oasis. Logistics is whether a soldier's boots are still intact after 1,000 miles. The Mongols had solved many logistical problems better than anyone else of their age. Their cavalry culture was built around endurance. A rider could travel with multiple horses, switching mounts to keep speed. Their diets were portable. Their tents could be taken down and raised quickly. Their armies were, in the right environment, like living organisms that could move without dragging heavy supply trains. But as the empire expanded into different environments, the old solutions did not always fit. In northern China, the open plains could still accommodate cavalry. But the deeper you went south, the more the land became a puzzle of rivers, hills, and humid heat. Horses suffered in wet climates. Disease could spread in crowded camps. Food had to be obtained not from grazing herds but from stored grain and organized transport. In the Middle East, armies crossed deserts where water was everything. Oases became strategic. The timing of movement mattered. A delayed caravan could mean thirst. A misjudged route could mean death. In Russia and Eastern Europe, winters could turn roads into ice and mud. Rivers could become highways when frozen and barriers when thawed. Forests limited the movement of large cavalry formations, and the distances between settlements could be vast. In Central Asia, the rhythm of life was shaped by oasis cities, by trade routes, by mountain passes. Control of a pass could mean control of a region. Snow in a pass could halt an army for weeks. Now think about what it means to coordinate an empire across all these environments at once. The great Khan might issue an order from the steppe, but the order would arrive in a different world. The commander receiving it might have to interpret it through local realities. The order might say, "Move quickly," but the road might be flooded. The order might say, "Gather troops," but the harvest might be late and the granaries empty. So authority, even in a unified empire, was always filtered through geography. This is why regional rulers became powerful. They understood their environment. They had local knowledge. They had local networks. The great Khan, far away, could not see the mud on the road. He could not smell the drought. The Mongols tried to overcome this with the yam, with census and administration, with delegating authority to princes and trusted generals. But delegation creates its own problem. The delegate becomes a ruler. Kublai in China was not merely a commander. He was a governor of a vast region. He had to make decisions daily. He built a court. He built relationships. He became, in practice, a king. Hulagu in Persia was not merely a commander. He was the founder of a new political order. He distributed lands. He appointed officials. He managed relationships with local elites. He became, in practice, a sovereign. Böke in the West was not merely a prince. He controlled trade routes and tribute systems. He negotiated with Russian princes. He managed steppe politics. He became, in practice, a monarch. So by the time Möngke died, the empire was already an empire of semi-autonomous powers. The only thing that could hold these powers together was the shared belief that there was still one center, one great Khan chosen by a collective ritual. That ritual was like a knot in a rope. The rope could be stretched, but as long as the knot held, the rope was one piece. When Kublai held a separate kurultai, the knot loosened. When Ariq Böke held another, the knot became two knots. The rope became two ropes tied to different posts. After that, even if Kublai won, the original knot could not be retied, because the act had shown that unity was not inevitable. It was a choice. Now, if you want a gentle metaphor to hold in your mind as you fall asleep, imagine a flock of birds migrating. When they fly in formation, they save energy. They move as one. But if the flock is startled or divided, smaller groups peel off. Each group finds its own path. They may still share the same sky, but they are no longer one movement. The Mongol Empire at its peak was like that formation, moving across Eurasia with astonishing speed and coordination. The decision of 1260 was like the sudden shift that broke the formation. The birds did not fall. They kept flying, but they flew in separate groups. And as each group flew, it encountered different winds, different temperatures, different landscapes. Each group changed in its own way. This is why the empire's fragmentation feels both tragic and inevitable. It was tragic because it ended a period of unified connectivity. It was inevitable because the physical and human realities were pushing in that direction. Now, we can also notice something quietly hopeful in this. Fragmentation did not mean the end of creativity or exchange. The Khanates continued to foster trade and culture in their own ways. The Yuan connected China to broader Eurasian networks. The Ilkhanate became a patron of Persian art and scholarship. The Golden Horde shaped the political development of Eastern Europe. The Chagatai world became a cradle for later Central Asian empires. So the crack did not only break, it also created new forms. History often works like that. A system fractures, and the fragments become seeds for new systems. The old unity becomes memory, but the memory itself becomes a resource. If you like, imagine the fragments of ice on a river. The river was once a single sheet. A crack appears. The sheet breaks into pieces. The pieces drift. Some melt. Some refreeze, some collide and form new shapes. The river continues. The Mongol Empire was one sheet of ice over the river of Eurasia. The decision at the kurultai cracked it. The pieces drifted into their own channels. And now, as you lie in the dark, none of this needs to be heavy. Let it be light. Let it be like watching clouds move across a night sky. Names and dates can fade. What remains is the pattern. Unity, strain, choice, fracture, transformation. And in the quiet of that pattern, you can feel the softness of time itself, stretching beyond any one empire, beyond any one decision, beyond any one life. Now let that softness carry you toward sleep. As the 13th century moved forward, the Mongol world continued to change in ways that made reunion increasingly impossible. Even if every prince had suddenly desired unity, the practical and cultural distances had grown too wide. In the Golden Horde, rulers were increasingly embedded in the Turkic and Islamic world of the Western Steppe and Volga region. The language of administration and daily life shifted. Alliances with Muslim merchants and neighboring powers mattered. The horde's interests centered on controlling trade routes to the Black Sea, on managing relationships with Russian principalities, and on maintaining dominance in the steppe. In the Ilkhanate, Persian administrators shaped the state. Mongol rulers adopted Persian court culture. Over time, conversion to Islam changed the ideological foundation of rule. The Ilkhans were no longer simply Mongol princes ruling over conquered lands. They became part of the Islamic political world, with its own expectations, its own legitimacy, its own sacred geography. In Central Asia, the Chagatai domain became a blend of nomadic and settled life. The region's role as a crossroads meant constant cultural mixing. Turkic languages became dominant in many areas. Islam spread and deepened. The Chagatai rulers often faced internal struggles between those who wanted to maintain steppe traditions and those who embraced urban and Islamic norms. In China, the Yuan dynasty developed a distinct imperial identity. Kublai and his successors built palaces and administrative systems. They interacted with Buddhist monks, Confucian scholars, and merchants from across Eurasia. They maintained Mongol privilege, but they also had to govern a vast, complex society. This governance made them, inevitably, different from the Mongols of the steppe. These differences were not superficial. They shaped how each khanate understood itself. They shaped what kind of ruler was seen as legitimate. They shaped what kind of future was desired. So the fracture of 1260 did not merely create political separation. It allowed cultural divergence to accelerate. And over time, divergence becomes identity, and identity becomes boundary. One of the most powerful forces in this divergence was religion. The early Mongol Empire was famously tolerant. It included Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, shamanists, and others. Mongol rulers often saw religion as a tool of legitimacy and diplomacy rather than a fixed identity. They could patronize multiple traditions. They could employ clergy of different faiths. But as khanates became more integrated into local societies, religious conversion became more common. Burke's Islam in the Golden Horde was one example. The Ilkhanate's eventual conversion was another. In China, Kublai patronized Tibetan Buddhism and used it as part of his imperial image. Religion provided a new kind of unity, but it was unity within each region, not across the empire. It gave each khanate its own ideological foundation. Now, imagine how this would affect the idea of a great Khan. If the great Khan in China is associated with Buddhist patronage and Chinese imperial rituals, why should a Muslim Khan in the West see him as a spiritual or moral center? If the Ilkhan in Persia is building legitimacy through Islamic institutions, why should he submit to a ruler who embodies a different sacred order? This is one reason the title of Great Khan became increasingly symbolic. It lacked a shared ideological foundation. Another force was economic. The Mongol Empire had, at its peak, facilitated trade across Eurasia. But once khanates became rivals, trade routes could become contested. Taxes and tariffs could increase. Wars could disrupt caravans. Merchants are adaptable. They find new routes. They negotiate. But the loss of a unified imperial protection increases risk. Risk increases cost. Cost changes trade patterns. Over time, this can shift the economic centers of regions. It can weaken the connective tissue of an empire. There is also the force of simple human memory. People living in Persia under the Ilkhans began to think of their rulers as part of Persian history, not as representatives of a steppe empire. People living in China under the Yuan thought of their rulers as Chinese emperors, even if foreign. The idea of a unified Mongol empire became something that belonged to the past, to the generation of conquest. This is another quiet lesson. Empires depend on living memory. They depend on people remembering a time when unity was real. As generations pass, that memory fades. New identities form. Now, let's follow one of the most fascinating aftereffects of Mongol fragmentation: the rise of new empires that claimed Mongol legacy. In Central Asia,